Looking to cover today is kind of going point by point in terms of what's required for hazardous materials training. So, what we're looking at is starting off with some general awareness, kind of what the regulations are, where they come from. Then we're going to talk a little bit about shipping batteries. So, that's going to be both lithium batteries and lead acid type batteries. I know you have both in inventory. Then we're going to go through the shipping requirements for limited quantities. So these are certain chemicals like corrosives and flammable liquids that your team ships and what those requirements look like. And then finally, finishing it off with some fire extinguisher, safety devices, again, other types of products that your team ships. So what we really want to focus on here is, of course, making sure that we're compliant in the eyes of the DOT. And the biggest part of training is what we call function specific training, where we're just providing instructions on how to ship the products that your team transports on a daily or weekly basis. So it's probably worth, exploring what are dangerous goods. So I use the term dangerous goods or the term hazardous material kind of interchangeably. So usually what you'll see is here in the United States, kind of the official terminology is hazardous material. The rest of the world uses the term dangerous goods, and it's the same thing. Articles or substances that pose a risk to health, safety, property, or the environment in transport. So there are thousands and thousands of chemicals, articles, substances that are regulated in transport. And in order to be regulated as a hazardous material, you would have to meet, or the product would have to meet one or more of the 9 hazard classes. So let's run through them real quick. Class 1, these are explosives. I don't think you have really anything in inventory that's going to be considered an explosive. What you will see common explosives are, obviously like, I don't know, bombs or dynamite, gunpowder, ammunition, fireworks. Those are the types of more common things that you might see as a class 1 explosive. Class 2, these are gases. So these are flammable gas, like propane. So propane tank is regulated as a class, or I should say Division 2.1 flammable gas. It also includes non-flammable gas, like a cylinder of nitrogen, and that also includes toxic gases. So from our perspective, as far as inventory goes, we do have gases, and the type of gases that we are shipping most commonly are aerosols. So if you think of any aerosol spray, that is contents under pressure, it is regulated as a class 2 for transport. So there are certain packaging and labeling requirements that we need to meet anytime we ship those types of gases and aerosols. Another one that's common to our inventory is class 3. These are flammable liquids, easily ignitable liquids, gasoline, ethanol. There's a whole, isopropanol. A lot of the in the alcohol family are regulated as a class 3 flammable liquid. Even something like a hand sanitizer typically has a flash point to the point that it makes it flammable for transport. So that's another thing for, our group is making sure that we identify our various products in inventory and go through them one by one to really understand which ones are regulated as hazmat and which ones are not. Moving down the chain, we have class 4. These are flammable solids, in addition to materials that are spontaneously combustible and materials that are dangerous when wet. So flammable solids, easily ignitable solid material, spontaneously combustible are kind of the self-reactives. And then materials that are dangerous when wet, we would consider just to be like water reactive. So don't really think we have anything in that category, typically in inventory. Moving down the chain, class 5, this is where we see oxidizers and organic peroxides. So oxidizers, things that are going to emit oxygen, which could lead or enhance combustion. And then when you get down to organic peroxides, these are typically industrial type chemicals, oftentimes also self-reactive, and usually need to be transported under certain like temperature stabilization. Class 6, poisons and infectious substances. So poisons are things that are, toxic to humans and animals. Should be straightforward there. And 6.2, infectious substances are things that are known or expected to contain a pathogen. So this would be, some type of medical sample that has possibly contaminated with a virus or bacteria. There's certain regulations around how those types of products are shipped to prevent the spread of any type of disease. Class 7, radioactive materials, so things that emit dangerous levels of radiation. I don't think your team is dealing with any of those, which is great. But Class 8 is one that is going to come up in your operation pretty frequently. These are corrosive materials. So these are strong acids or strong bases that are that cause what the standard is that it causes destruction of human skin. So this is, like certain types of cleaners, acid cleaners. I know a big one for your team is going to be lead acid batteries. So excuse me, as we'll talk about, there is a difference between lithium batteries and lead acid batteries. Lead acid batteries are, just as the name would kind of imply, are the kind of the car batteries where you might pick it up and if you shake it around, you might be able to kind of feel the liquid moving around inside there. Well, as the name says, it's a lead acid battery, so the liquid inside of that battery is extremely acidic, which is why it is regulated as a Class 8 corrosive anytime that we ship them. Then we get to Class 9. So Class 9 are, it's kind of considered the miscellaneous category. These are things that are known, known hazardous. There's the weird things like dry ice, some environmental pollutants, some aviation regulated liquids that are like irritants. But for us, I think the biggest one, the one that we care the most about, is going to be lithium batteries. So lithium batteries are considered Class 9 hazardous material. And so whether it's a small battery that's powering your cell phone or a larger format battery, it is going to be considered Class 9. And then as we'll go through today's training, you're going to see the differences in terms of how you ship some of the smaller batteries versus the larger, more energetic batteries. But we will get there soon. It's also important, just to kind of remind ourselves here that I think last time I was down in Atlanta, we talked about the shipping process. It sounds like a lot of the stuff you're shipping is going to be shipped within the United States, but it's not exclusively shipped within the U.S. So you do make international shipments as well. So it's just important for us to understand kind of what these different regulations are. Today's training is going to go through the different modes of transport and what is required, for the difference if you're shipping something by air versus ground. But from what we're looking at here in the United States, the regulations that govern transport of hazmat in the U.S. called the 49 CFR, specifically, I think I have it up here, parts 100 through 180. And these are available for free online there at ecfr.gov. So these rules certainly apply to U.S. transport, U.S. ground and rail mainly. And then if you're shipping something by ocean, there's a standard, it's the IMDG code. So this is for international ocean shipments. You're expected to package, mark, label, and document your dangerous goods in accordance with that book. Operating within Europe, European Highway, the ADR standard. Operating in Canada, Transportation of Dangerous Goods regulations. And then probably one that's going to be very important for us is international air transport. So if you're shipping hazmat by air, typically the carrier is going to be following the IATA dangerous goods regulations. So you need to be aware that, what those rules are and how to make sure that we comply with them for any of our air shipments moving forward. There we go. So, when we're talking about shipping hazardous material, a good place to start is, well, to define what hazardous materials are, but then kind of going that next step in terms of like responsibility or liability. So the way the regulations are set up is that it's the shipper's responsibility to properly comply with all hazmat regulations. And the shipper is kind of best thought of as not necessarily who's on the from line of an address label. Also, it's not whose product it is. From a DOT perspective, the shipper is the company that's responsible / liable for any sort of incidents or non-compliance. And the shipper is the company that kind of the official term is that performs pre-transportation functions. So that's kind of a legal term, pre-transportation function for basically preparing the shipment. So which company's employees are classifying as to whether the product's hazmat or not? Which company is putting the hazmat in the package? Which company is closing the package? Which company is putting the marks and labels on the box? Which company is filling out the shipping paper? That is the company that is responsible for compliance, and therefore any sort of incidents or violations usually what happens is enforcement action is started up against the company. Further, the company that tenders or gives hazmat to the carrier for transport. So this is something that I'm sure your team understands, but I'm sure you're warehousing. Well, I know you're warehousing and shipping various products from various suppliers. Just because it's another company's product, that's kind of irrelevant if it's your company, again, that is packaging, marking, labeling, and documenting any sort of non-compliance or incident is going to come back to your company for enforcement. So anything that's in your warehouse, your distribution center, that you grab off a shelf, put in a box, and ship, it is absolutely your company that's responsible for meeting all applicable requirements. So I think we probably already understand that, but that's really important to make sure that we kind of all internalize what those implications are for not following these rules. Because as we'll talk about a little bit, the violations of hazmat regulations often result in significant financial penalties against the company. It can result in companies being shut down, or I shouldn't say shut down, but prevented from shipping certain types of hazardous material until DOT is satisfied with the fact that you're doing it right. So again, always make sure that we can comply with these regulations to the best of our ability at all times. So if you're looking through common violations of the regulations, really the number one most frequently cited violation is going to be around training. So failure to train employees or not having proper training records, usually year after year, is the most frequently cited because it's also one that's very easy for the inspectors to identify. From the inspector's point of view, if the company ships hazmat and has never had training, it's probably likely that they're making mistakes elsewhere in the chain in terms of if they've never been trained, how do they know what labels go on there, what packaging to use, etc. But that's by far, no means the only thing that is cited. You also see penalties for undeclared shipments. Undeclared shipments are, if you have hazmat in a box and there's no marks, there's no labels, there's no paperwork, there's nothing to indicate that hazmat is present. That's considered an undeclared shipment. That's where companies get into a lot of trouble. You'll see violations for not doing shipping paperwork correctly, not having the correct packaging, no emergency response information. These types of incidents or violations, I should say, once they are actually settled between the DOT and the company, they do become a matter of public record. So there are some databases you can go in to do various searches to see which companies have been penalized and for what regulations that they violated. Obviously we would prefer not to be on any of those types of lists. Also, kind of as it relates to enforcement, number one most frequently cited violation is training. So what are the training requirements? What do we actually have to do? Who do we need to train? So the way to think about it, and if I put my DOT hat back on, so I should have mentioned earlier, I've been a private consultant now for about 9 years. Prior to that, I worked for the the Pipeline and Hazmat Safety Administration, and that is the agency within DOT that writes all the rules and regulations for transporting hazmat. So I used to be on the regulator side of the fence, now working with private businesses. And so people always ask me, they understand that training is important. And so the question then becomes all right, we are a company that ships hazardous material. Who do we need to train within our organization to be compliant in the eyes of the DOT? The DOT folks are going to tell you to try to cast a wide net. I think they would always say that more training is probably better than less, right? But from a true regulatory sense, training is absolutely required if you are, again, performing those types of pre-transportation functions. So if you're an employee that is classifying hazmat, putting hazmat into a package, putting a label on the package, filling out shipping paper, sometimes even loading, unloading, transporting hazmat, if you are involved in that process, if it's just one of the things listed, you need to have some level of training and a training record to show that you have completed necessary DOT training. So this is one of those things that, it might be helpful after today's call to kind of sit down and think about the organization in terms of who absolutely needs training because they're involved in the packaging, marking, label, documentation process. And then I'm sure there's others in the organization that, maybe don't perform any of these regulated functions, but maybe it's still good to have training and awareness of what these rules are. But at minimum, we need to absolutely make sure that anybody that's performing those types of regulated functions have training. So that's going to be, of course, our team on the call today. But as for people that weren't able to join or anybody that's new to the organization in the coming weeks and year, obviously send them toward this training material to get them trained and certified. Good news, training does last for a period of 3 years. So this is something that we're, at least for this group, completing, late January of 2025. Recurrent training would not be required for another 3 years, so Jan of 2028. Oftentimes it might be helpful to do recurrent training earlier, just so you stay fresh with the material. But again, at minimum, it is required at least every 3 years. And training records must be maintained and accessible on site. So that can be an electronic record, that can be a hard copy, whatever you choose to do. After I get all the quiz submissions in, I will make training records for each and every one of you that's completed it. I will have those records sent over electronically to Ron. And so Ron will have records of them. If you do have a DOT inspection and you can't find them, you can always email me. I will also have a record of them, so we will make sure that they are available upon request. So really the last thing on the general awareness, the general awareness thing, it's funny because any regulated DOT program, you have to have general awareness, safety, security, and then function specific. And, there's no standard or requirement that you spend X amount of time on any part of it. It's just a matter of, kind of educating people on what the requirements are. And so from my point of view, general awareness, it's important, to understand, hey, DOT has regulations. If you violate those regulations, you could get in trouble. Here's what, an overview of what hazardous materials are. But I don't think we need to dwell on that too much, because I do like to get as far into the function specific side of things as possible, in terms of, you're shipping product X, here's the package, marks, labels, documentation, and then just kind of go through that chain to make sure we understand all the rules and regulations. But from the from the general awareness side, again, just kind of that introduction to what these regulations are. Safety security is also something that it's kind of almost like common sense. So from the safety side, you're looking at products from your inventory that are regulated as hazardous materials. So there are things like lithium batteries, lead acid batteries, corrosives, flammable liquids, fire extinguishers. So these types of things are hazmat. So when we are handling them on site, just again, it's common sense, but keep in mind that they are dangerous for a reason. So we're not throwing aerosols around the building, or just not handling them with care. So we want to make sure we handle everything with care. And then a big one for us is to understand what the hazards are and what our response may be. So what I mean by that is, you might have a 1 liter thing of 1 liter bottle of flammable liquid. If you spill that, what do you do? How do you clean that up? What is your response for fire, for spills? Also, I know, like I mentioned earlier, your team does deal with some of the corrosives, so the acids. So, the lead acid battery is a good example. If somebody drops a lead acid battery, it cracks and there's, fluid on the ground, how do we identify that? How do we make sure that we are not touching it and making sure to clean it up as fast as possible? So a lot of that safety training you've probably done elsewhere, just kind of as general knowledge, but just keep in mind hazmat is hazardous for a reason, so handle with care and understand your spill and fire response. Security side is also kind of just more, common sense. So hazmat is hazmat for a reason, and it, if stolen, could be weaponized. So what that means from the security side is that you are taking reasonable measures to limit access to the facility, so you don't have random members of the public walking through there, which I know you don't. Things are locked, inventory is kind of checked up on, making sure nothing's missing. Security procedures, like I said, when I was at the facility, whenever that was a while back, it looks like things are properly secured. Wouldn't have too many concerns about that, but just keep in mind, hazmat could be weaponized. So you want to make sure that you're doing anything within reason to prevent them from being stolen. So I'm going to pause there. Yep, I'm going to pause there before we start talking through batteries just to see if we have any questions from the team. All right, I'm not seeing anything. Oh, also, I think I mentioned earlier, you can certainly take yourself off mute to ask questions, but I also do have the Teams window open, so I'll be able to see things like in the written chat feature if you want to go in that direction. Okay, so we are going to flip here to batteries. So notice here, I didn't put shipping lithium batteries, shipping lead acid batteries. I'm kind of lumping batteries together. And so there's different